Well, hi there. Welcome to my podcast, Her Shrink Ray Eye. I'm Joan, and I'll be talking to you about miniatures of all kinds, from historical figures to fictional box dioramas. Today I'll share a little bit about the path that led me here, miniature cake decorations, a tiny kitchen sink, and my love of tinkering with things. So let me start by telling you a little bit about why I'm doing this podcast and what kinds of ideas I want to explore in coming episodes. I want to question everything about art and miniatures and see if we can discover what these small pieces of resin and plastic can reveal about us and the world. Also, let me tell you a little bit about where the name of the podcast comes from. My love of science fiction, obsession with eyes, and my view of art and the hobby of miniatures helped shape the name. Science fiction, for me, makes the impossible possible. Eyes tell a lot about a person, and I view the hobby as an expression of ideas without being bound to rules and convention. That's why I chose a name that's a little different and a little abstract, but concrete enough to let listeners know that this podcast is from the viewpoint of a woman and that the world I'm discussing is small. So, what is a shrink ray anyway? If you are familiar with science fiction, a shrink ray is often portrayed as some type of machine or a gun that can shrink down objects and people to various small scales. I kind of like this analogy to our hobby as the lens we're looking through at the objects, creatures, and people that we paint, build, or sculpt. They've been shrunk down in real life. So that's kind of where the name comes from. So in general, this podcast is for anyone who loves miniatures and sees them not just as toys, but as a deeply personal form of artistic expression. I think that's really important. Artistic expression is something that adds a lot of richness to our lives. We don't have to be bound by rules and evaluation, because I think that suppresses our creativity. I want to ask some hard questions. We don't even need to come up with the answers, but maybe by delving into hard questions like, why aren't more women part of the hobby? We can at least contemplate how this could change, or it may never change. Or why we don't see more miniatures in art galleries. I just want to ask some questions that make people think. A lot of these questions won't have answers. Maybe some of them will, but hopefully it gets us all thinking about some ideas about our hobby that maybe we don't often think about. I would like to cover topics that don't have easy answers. And maybe they don't have any answers. When you question things like art and creation, why we're compelled to do something, it often becomes a very complex subject. And it's kind of like the more you look at it, the more complex it can become. We may have some common ground, and we may not, but art and creation is a very personal thing, and it's not the same for everybody. Everybody has their different ideas, and that's great. This podcast is kind of looking through my lens at everything, my shrink ray of the whole world, and what I can make in miniatures. So to start things, in this first episode, I'd like to talk a little bit about who I am. My name is Joan Biediger. I live in Salt Lake City, and I've been interested in miniatures since I was a child. One of My favorite memories is the dread of having to go to the local Hallmark store with my mom and my grandmother to look at stationery. And that is until I discovered they had a wall of tiny cake decorations. Wow, I could stand there for the entire half an hour, however long they were looking at stationery and pens. I would be peering at these little packages with tiny parasols, tiny animals. It all seemed like treasure to me. They could hardly pull me away. And I would often, as my reward for going to Hallmark, I would often come home with some tiny parasol or some kind of miniature trinket from the cake decorating aisle. Another thing about me is as a kid, I wasn't really into dolls very much, but I was fascinated with Barbie shoes and all the miniature accessories that went with them. My mom would knit me little sweaters, and I just loved the clothes and the little things that went with it. For me, that was the big appeal. As a little girl, probably maybe 9 or 10, I had this miniature kitchen sink. I don't know where it came from. It was just this small, I don't even know what scale it was, smaller than anything a Barbie would have, but it actually had a reservoir that you could fill up with water, and you could turn on the sink and run the water. I was fascinated with this thing. I would take it apart and put it back together, and by the time I was done with it, it wasn't working very well, but man, I knew how that little kitchen sink worked. I loved that thing. I think my fascination with this miniature sink was more about the fact that it was small and that it ran water like a real kitchen sink. I don't think it necessarily had to be a sink for me to be obsessed by it. It could have been anything that was a miniature replica of a real-world object. To me, there's a strange magic about small things and being able to hold something that exists in your real or imagined world in your hand. In my mind, these small objects, miniature plastic animals, tiny cake decorations, they all had a story and were animated in my mind as a child. For me, this has carried over to my love and fascination with miniatures and the stories I can tell when I'm creating, constructing, and painting dioramas and figures. I feel like the joy I had playing with these small toys has evolved and matured all these years later in this great hobby of ours. Maybe you have a similar story to mine from your childhood. However you got here, I think it's a wonderful hobby. This leads me to another reason why I love this hobby of miniatures and putting scale models together. My dad was a mechanic, and I grew up around him taking things apart and putting them together. Cars, motorcycles, radios, anything that could be taken apart. He liked to tinker with it and put it back together. So I think that kind of gave me a love of, putting things together anyway. I also love, kind of on a side note, I love metal and wooden puzzles that you can put together, book nooks. I love all of that stuff. Anything I can put together. These days I don't take them apart as much, but every once in a while there's some electronic gadget that I need to take apart to see how it works. But that was an early influence on me. So my first introduction to the hobby was probably 25, 30 years ago, and my husband introduced me to that. Barry does the Small Subjects podcast with Jim Dioramas. When we were first together, he showed me his Napoleonic figures. Wow, I was just so blown away by those. They were so realistic but small. I was drawn to them right away. They were like little miniature works of art and history all rolled up into one. I've always been interested in history and even minored in it in college, so I loved the uniforms of the Napoleonic era, and to see that you could paint something like that with such detail and accuracy was a really big draw for me. So this really seemed to fit my fascination with miniatures. It always seemed incredible to me that something life-size could be made small and fit in the palm of your hand. Probably the first thing that I built myself was I also have a love of fairground rides. So my first build was a plastic model IHC fairground ride of carousels. I love carousels. That really drew me in, all the detail and beauty of rides like that. So my first foray into plastic models was IHC fairground ride with tester's enamel. That was a challenge for sure. It's interesting, I wasn't really interested in making something that would go to a show. I wasn't really even familiar with shows. I had so much fun building the carousel, and I also built a dragon swing ride. The dragon ride, I didn't even paint it all. I left some of it just the bare plastic. But I think that's kind of a thing when you first start out. It's like you're building this for fun, and you're not building it for a show. It's just for you. And I still build stuff like that to this day. I don't really care if it gets a prize or if it goes to a show. It's just the pure joy of building something or painting something for me. So when I started out, I didn't go to shows at all. Barry went to shows. He went to the SCAMS show in California. That was the Southern California Area Historical Miniature Society show in Orange County. And he brought me home a flat tin figure from that show. A flat tin figure is an engraved metal figure or scene that has some relief on it. And that was my first object or figure that I painted. It can be a challenge to paint the volumes of these types of figures, but I was hooked. I was really hooked once I tried it. After that, I did start to go to shows. SCAMS was the first show I went to, and I loved that show. Everyone was very welcoming, and the show had a great atmosphere. I remember walking around the vendors area and seeing a bunch of these flat tin figures for sale, and had a wonderful conversation with a man named Jim Horan who was selling the flat tin figures. But he spent probably half an hour talking to me, encouraging me to paint them. And, he seemed so happy that somebody was interested in it. And that had a great impression on me. His encouragement and welcoming attitude has stuck with me for years after that show. The show also had what is known as the traditional hospitality suite, and I have such fond memories of hearing wonderful stories about other shows and painting miniature figures, art. I think the most striking thing for me was the friendships that people had built over many years because of this shared love of miniatures and painting. I really think even all these years later that it is the most important thing that I've gained from being part of this hobby is the incredible friendships with people from all over the world. The figure painting community has regional shows in the United States and all across the world. In the United States, a figure show is where figure painters and modelers are able to display their work and have their work evaluated by judges. You can attend seminars, But mostly, at least for me, it's a social gathering where people get to talk about their love of miniatures with old friends and hopefully make new friends. It's a great way to have encouragement and to keep going. Unfortunately, these days, the Scams show was shut down many years ago, but shows I still go to almost every year are Chicago and MFCA. MFCA takes place in Pennsylvania. And when we can, we like to go to the Long Island show in New York. Someday I'd also like to attend the Atlanta Figure Show. There's a small show in Washington, D.C. and Tulsa, Oklahoma. So I have also been to several International Plastic Modeling Society shows or IPMS shows over the years as well. My first experience at a national IPMS show was the San Marcos show in 2023. Just in my opinion, there was a different atmosphere from the figure shows. I don't think it's on purpose. I think it's just a different group of people, and probably there are even fewer women that go to IPMS shows and display their work. Probably my first, right off the bat at the registration desk, it was funny because the man at the desk kept asking me what my husband's name was, and it took him a few minutes to realize the registration I was asking for was for me, not for my husband. He was very apologetic, but that was a different experience for me. That was a big contrast between the figure shows and IPMS for me. I think so few women participate in these shows. It may not be as welcoming a place for women. It might just seem that way, but I don't know. Hopefully at some point that can change in the future. So for my first 20 years in the hobby, I stuck to painting flat figures. Flat figures seem to be a good entry point in the hobby for canvas painters like I was. It's a similar experience. I'm not sure why, but it also seems to be an area of the hobby where there are more female artists. About 5 years ago, I got interested in round figures and more plastic models like Machine and Krieger and spaceships. I have a love of multiple genres, historical, sci-fi, fantasy. Round figures seemed very unapproachable to me, but I did get out of my comfort zone, and it's been great to widen my horizons with round figures and more types of plastic models. I left behind the railroad models for many, many years, although I still have a large stash of them. I haven't worked with them very much, but going back into something that's 3D, both round figures and plastic models it's really widened my enjoyment of the hobby. I don't feel so boxed in with just doing flat figures. So my latest obsession, though, is with box dioramas. I thought about doing a box diorama, which I should tell you what a box diorama is first off. A box diorama is a type of diorama or a scene created inside a box of some sort. They can be very small, even as small as existing inside an Altoids tin, a shoebox, or they can be very large, almost big enough that you can sit on a chair and look inside. Often you can see them in museum displays. The Chicago Art Institute has a wonderful display of miniature rooms that you can take a look at. But really, for years, I had a notebook full of ideas for box dioramas, and I kept thinking, man, there's just no way I can do that. But I finally decided I was going to try one, and I built my first box diorama about a year ago. To me, again, this is another eye-opening evolution for me as a miniature artist. There is so much room for creativity and storytelling with box dioramas. Also, there's some artistic and technical challenges involved. You're controlling the viewer's perspective. There's lighting to consider, electronics. It's a really unique way of interacting with your viewer. You're telling a story, and you can make the story as, as concrete or as abstract as you want. The viewport, you've got a viewer looking into it. The lighting, the great thing is you can control all the lighting in a box diorama. You don't have to depend on room lighting. So my first box diorama was a statement about AI, or artificial intelligence, and how that's affecting the art world. It's quite a subject that creates a lot of angst for a lot of people. So I kind of wanted to depict the turmoil and the fear that's been generated around that. So I created an old, peeling and decayed series of rooms that moved back in perspective. And the box featured a robot that I constructed out of old model pieces, wires, and putty. And the robot is removing the heads of famous artists to drain all their knowledge in their heads to create these AI-generated paintings. So I wanted to use very recognizable artists. So I chose Salvador Dali, Frida Kahlo, Van Gogh, and Andy Warhol. It's a somewhat gruesome depiction, but it graphically depicts how an AI art extracts the talents of real artists to create these bizarre mashups of great art. The box is kind of like a miniature it's kind of an immersive theater if you think about it, but one aspect in time. So that's my current obsession. It was a great learning experience for me, and I felt like it really pushed me forward and got my creative thoughts going, and I still keep my notebook with all kinds of ideas written down in it. So one thing I want to do with this show is I'm hoping to appeal to women artists in all backgrounds, maybe not even just miniatures. I come from a fine art background where I studied drawing and painting and ceramics in college, and it gave me a great background for this world of miniatures. So I'm hoping to spark some interest from other women artists, maybe get people interested in miniatures. I'd love to see more women become active in this hobby of figure painting and scale modeling. This is a very male-dominated hobby. Very few women, especially plastic modelers, very few women are active compared to men. I think sometimes the viewpoint of women in all aspects of the hobby is not a loud one because there's so few of us. I also think there are probably a whole lot of women out there who may be involved in the hobby but just don't post their work and they don't go to shows. I have 2 women in my family who actually love miniatures and have been interested in scale modeling for many years, but they've really never ventured into actually doing the hobby. It'd be interesting to know why that's the case. I don't think it's a matter of just subject matter. I've heard a lot of people say that there aren't subjects for women. And I really think that that is not true, especially with 3D printing. There's so much more variety out there for everybody, not just women. But I also think it's an incorrect assumption that women don't like building and painting tanks and airplanes. I have a pretty good stash of tanks and airplanes myself. I mean, I love any type of machine. And I really think that there are probably a lot of women out there that enjoy this subject matter as well. So I don't think it's just a matter of there's not enough subject matter out there to interest women. So my vision for the show and what you can expect in coming episodes, I want to talk about a lot of different things. This is mostly going to be a solo podcast, just me talking to you. And occasionally I would love to get some women or some men even, anybody. I'd like to have some guests to talk about different things. I'd like to talk about art, craft, trends, philosophy, creativity. I'd like to interview people that are inside the hobby and outside the traditional modeling sphere that we're in. There are so many offshoots out there that are like almost parallel to the miniature figure painting and scale modeling. There's some miniaturists they only show in galleries. We never see them at figure shows. They're not really part of any of the online communities. There's clay artists out there. There's room builders. There's people that build the book nooks. Those are small. They're kits, but they're very similar to scale modeling. You're putting something together. Hopefully we can learn some things together, maybe bust some myths about different things. I think we can learn a lot from other hobbies or those close offshoots. I'm hoping this is a place for reflection, thought, and sometimes disagreement. These are my thoughts. I certainly welcome people to disagree with what I say, and I certainly would listen to what anybody else has to say. I think mostly if we're more reflective and think about things on a deeper level, it just adds to our hobby. If we think about things, reflect more on ideas and the thought behind what we're doing, I think it just makes our hobby a richer experience for everyone. So my opinions are my own. I respect anyone that disagrees with what I say. I'm hoping that even if you don't agree with me, at least I'll make you think about a topic or a perspective that maybe you haven't really given much thought to before, as it comes from my perspective is different from a lot of people's. So if this sounds like your kind of quiet rebellion, subscribe, follow, or just carve out a little time to listen. Episodes drop every other Wednesday, and I'll be right here with my lamp on, my brush in my hand, story waiting, deep thought, all of that. Until next time, keep your hands steady, see clearly, nod obediently, and keep your story your own. Thanks for listening.